Years ago, there was some replica Winchester Model 97s that were being imported into the country. And at that time, I was working at a gun shop in Westminster, California, the Stockade that doesn't exist anymore. But they would get these things in, and they were a relatively inexpensive gun being an import, and they were pretty rough. But I decided, at that time, because I was into kind of ripping things apart and doing a smooth and tune and reliability packages and all of that kind of thing, not for the shop, just for my own personal use, I thought that would be a real good project for me. So I got one of these things. The stocks that were on it weren't that great, so I replaced them with some nicer looking walnut stuff. And then at the time, I was also playing with Duracoat. And one of the things I thought I would be fun to do was to invent my own camouflage patterns. So I came up with my own idea, and I put that on this shotgun. And it was always something that I thought I would just kind of keep around the house for more of a personal defense. Once in a while, take out and have some fun with it. A lot of guys will use these for cowboy action shooting. Of course, the military have used them. The trench gun and the military version then would have a bayonet lug and a bayonet on the bottom side there. But this, for me, I thought was always going to be something just to kind of keep around the house as personal defense. I like 12 gauge for that. 45 ACP is another one that I kind of like for that. Inside the house, handguns, shotguns, 12 gauge is my preference. And then for a little bit further shot, maybe perimeter, I like to go to a carbine. And for long shots, my preference is to transition at that point to a rifle. But one of the things I kind of like about the Winchester Model 97 is that this gun and also the Ithaca Model 37 is a shotgun that you can slam fire. Now, typically a slam fire is not something that you would find desirable at all. However, when it comes to these things, when you close the action, if you simply hold the trigger down, the hammer will follow down. So I closed the action, got my finger off of the trigger. Now, as I pull the trigger, the hammer falls. The gun fires. I work the slide, I pull the pump action, slide action rearward. It's going to eject the spent shot shell. And as I hold the trigger down and the slide comes forward again, you're going to notice here that the hammer is going to fall. Bang. So as fast as you can work this thing, you are shooting this with a little bit of practice as fast as you can shoot any semi-automatic handgun. So for a personal defense setup, as long as you're willing to practice and understand what you have in your hand and be able to use it properly, in my opinion, it's a good way to go. Of course, you're training your brain to keep your finger on the trigger. When you have something else in your hand, you need to keep your finger away from the trigger. So it's sort of a double-edged sword on that note. So you use your judgment with regard to that. But typically shorter barrels like this, whether you got an 18 or a 20 inch, if it's going to be a fixed choke gun, typically they'll come from the manufacturer. When I say fixed choke, by the way, I mean that it does not have screw-in chokes. So it would typically be like a cylinder bore, which is a more open type choke, which is what you want if you're going to shoot slugs or buckshot, tactical type of stuff. If you have either cylinder bore or improved cylinder is going to tighten it up just a tiny bit. And those are going to be chokes that are going to be appropriate for a relatively short shot. And by relatively short shot, what I'm talking about is perhaps inside of 20 yards. So when you're looking at different charts of how you want to shoot, distance-wise, and how the gun is going to pattern, and I've got a piece of cardboard set up right behind us here, and we're going to talk just a little bit about patterning a shotgun if that's not something that you're familiar with. The choke, in conjunction with the wad that's in the shot shell itself, determines how the pattern, how the pellets inside the shotgun shell are going to spread, how quickly at a particular distance. So typically if you have like an improved cylinder or a cylinder bore gun, it's going to spread out reasonably wide and you can hit your target within 20 yards and under. Now, years ago, when I was real heavy into shooting trap and sporting clays, I would typically use a modified choke for a 16-yard trap, and a lot of the sporting clay shots modified, because 20 yards to 35 yards is where I typically would like to use the modified choke. 35 yards and beyond, my personal preference at that point was to transition to, or with removable choke, something you can screw out real fast and screw in, would be a full choke. So a full choke is going to keep the shot patterned tighter for a further distance. So if you've got the duck from the tower coming from behind you and going pretty high and off maybe to your left, that's going to be a relatively, well, a comparatively longer shot than, say, the rabbit that's going to be coming up, you know, within maybe 10 yards in front of you. In that instance, you probably want to have your improved cylinder or cylinder bore choke in the gun. So for this, for personal defense, inside the house or maybe immediately outside the house, it's going to be, again, a relatively short shot. So a cylinder bore or improved cylinder choke would be the order of the day. Now you can actually use bird shot. To me, 7.5 is getting to be a little bit on the small side for personal defense inside the house, but I'm going to show you here in just a minute. It can be really, really effective. Now, if you're not familiar with the shot sizes, the way the numbering system works, the higher the number, for example, a lot of guys who shoot skeet will like using number 9s or maybe even number 8s. That's a very small pellet, and there's lots of them, more of them, because they're smaller, and you can get more into that wad inside the shot shell. Typically, I use 7.5s, and that was my go-to load. My load at that time, because I was shooting a lot of trap and sporting clays, 16-yard trap, and then I'd hit the sporting clays course. In a 12 gauge, 2 3/4 inch, I would use 1 1/8 ounce of 7.5 shot. And I was loading on a Dillon SL 900, and that was blowing through a lot of shot shells every single week. So my standard load was either 17 or 17.5 grains of 700X using a compression formed Winchester AA wad. Now the primers, typically I'd go with the Winchester if I didn't have Winchesters on hand. It's the type of primer is what's important. It's a 209. You can substitute brand, you don't substitute the type. So if it says a 209, don't use a Magnum, just use the 209 like the recipe will tell you. But typically I would find that using 7.5s across the board in a 2 3/4 inch shell would work pretty well for trap and then most of your sporting clay shots. Inside the house, or maybe if you're doing rabbit, some smaller game, you know, maybe you go to a little bit larger shot, because the smaller the number, the larger the diameter of the shot. So for example, 6s or 4s, a little bit larger pellet, that can be a little bit more effective, particularly on game type birds or small mammals. Shotguns coming from the manufacturer with a fixed bore would typically be cylinder bore or improved cylinder. So you can shoot buck, you can shoot slugs, you can shoot bird shot, you're good to go. But if you want to be able to change out those chokes, you got to get something, or you can take your barrel to a gunsmith and they can thread it for you. And then you can use screw-in chokes across the board. But the Winchester Model 97 is going to be this one. Although it does have screw-in chokes, I do have the improved cylinder choke in there, so I can use bird, I can use buck, and I can shoot slugs out of it for those purposes. But for the patterning, if you're not familiar with the concept of the pattern, typically at a lot of the shotgun parks, you would have a pattern board, and you'd put out maybe 20 yards or so. You've got the pattern board, you grab the paint, and you make it nice and white, and you'd stand back that distance, and you just shoot at it. And you would look at how the individual pellets are lining up on that pattern board. Or you can take a big piece of butcher paper. You can take, like I've got here, just a big piece of cardboard from a cardboard box that I'd folded up. But I'm going to stand back a little bit out of camera shot. I'm only about maybe 15 or 16 so feet that the iPhone is set up from the target. And I want to stand back a little bit more, so I'm going to be out of the shot here a little bit. But I'm going to drop one into the chamber here and close that up. Now I'm going to stand back out of shot of the camera. I'm going to shoot at the cardboard, and you're going to see exactly how it lines up on the paper. Now, as we look at this, this is where the wad went through. In fact, let me bring this a little bit closer so you can kind of see. Now, using 1 1/8 ounce of 7.5 shot, you can see how those little individual holes are lining up on that piece of paper. Now, I'm well within 20 yards. So if, for example, you were using this as personal defense inside your house, you can see how absolutely devastating that can be if you're using it down a hallway or on a relatively short shot. Now, this is 7.5. Again, if you use like number 6s or number 4s, small game loads are really, really effective. So shotguns, 12 gauge inside the house, 45 ACP is my personal preference. Perimeter stuff, I like a carbine. Longer shots, I like to transition to a rifle. But don't be afraid of these Chinchesters if you want to do a smooth and tune or whatever on them. I think at the shop, you know, for tactical stuff, Benelli's were always very popular. The M2s, the M4s, of course, the Mossberg 500s, the 590s, the Remington Model 870, and there's lots of different imports that have come into the country. You can find something for every budget. They're fun to go out. You can do some clay birds. You know, you can do cowboy action shooting. There's a whole lot of versatility you can get out of these things. If you don't have one, get one. Go out and play with them. They're a hoot. Happy trails.